had so many combos with people who were just like unaligned with what we're doing. And I was just so sick of it. And then just on that weekend where I was like, telling my co-founder, I was like, okay, we're like ending this after this week. And then on that Friday, that's when she was like, yeah, I'm in and I'll co-lead the round.
This is Funded, a show where founders who raised millions in venture capital share the gritty side of what it actually took to get that money in the bank. I'm Jason Ye. Not too long ago, I was trying to get my ideas funded. And back in the day, I was a VC listening to founders pitch me for money. The most aggravating and comforting part of fundraising is that it only takes one yes for it all to change. Everyone's saying no, and then one yes changes everyone's minds. That being said, it can take quite a few no's in order to reach that one yes, sometimes hundreds. Working with founders, I've realized that not every founder is able to push through that amount of rejection in order to reach the promised land. Most times, right when you want to give up is exactly when you need to push through the most. Lucky for the founder I'm speaking to today, she was able to push through and reach that one yes that made every no she'd received from investors all worthwhile. Today, I'm speaking with Christal Wang, co-founder and CEO of Shimmer, the #1 ADHD coaching platform for adults. After moving through YC and closing a successful pre-seed round, they ended up pivoting and facing some challenges when going out to raise their seed round. They stuck it out and ended up closing a $2.2 million seed round, announced this January. But before we talk about her round, we ended up realizing we had quite the similar childhood.
So I have ADHD that has been established. And actually, when I was a kid, it makes a lot of sense looking back now, but I was always, there was like a few phases when I was really young. I was kind of the class clown. I was always saying what I was not supposed to be saying at the wrong time. And I had this special seat that was right next to the teacher so that I would not bother anyone else. That was in the positive moments. There were some teachers that were worse where I had to sit in the corner or I had to be away from friends or I had to make sure that I was like facing a direction where I wouldn't distract anyone. So that was kind of the earlier ages. And then as I got older, I started to like channel my energy into non-class stuff. So it was really interesting where I would I have these memories of me by the door of the classroom, like sharpening my pencil. And then when the teacher looked the other way, I would like run out and I would just disappear for the rest of the class. And I would do that almost every class because I was just so incredibly bored during class. I was not interested in what the teacher had to say. And I felt like class was just like one step in this like larger process of needing to like 6 months later regurgitate the same stuff onto a piece of paper and then forget about
Yeah.
it. So I got super involved in sports. I got really involved. I worked actually full time while I was in high school. My boss at the mall, and my boss was like, "Don't you have to go to school?" And I was like, "No, no, I'm gonna work here." It just was more interesting to me. So I think I always had this like unconventional way of going through life, and I think I have been blessed by great parents and a great household that I had the support system to be able to kind of act out within boundaries. And there
Well,
were
I want to jump in there because people might not see your face if they're only listening to the audio, but it seems like you're Asian American like me.
Asian
And
Canadian,
say it again.
Asian Canadian.
Asian Canadian. I'm sorry, such an
Okay.
insult.
Okay.
You are Asian of Asian origin of
Mhm.
background like me, and so I also am ADD. Undiagnosed, but I know I am at least somewhere on the spectrum. But that at least in my household, that would never be something that was like acknowledged, right? And
Mhm.
uh, I know even though you it looked like you were skipping school, skipping class, probably didn't do that badly because you ended up going to decent schools. So tell me a little bit about how you balance this within your household and like sounds like supportive parents, but I'm curious where that upbringing and the dynamic like all played into how you got to where you are.
Yeah, I've reflected on this a lot, and I think it's a compilation of a few things. So one, I'm very competitive and I like to figure out like the most efficient way to do things and and to kind of like I don't know how to explain it, but for example, when I was younger, at one point, my parents told me that like, if you're spending our money, then you have to follow our rules. So that's why I went out and got a full-time job at like 13. I was like, oh, okay, so I need to earn my own money. That obviously didn't go very well when I came home with my rationale. But same with school. My parents, I like all most Asian parents, I had to get A's. And so my parents would always say, okay, well, if you get an A here, then you don't need to do this. Or if you have a bad grade, then you don't get this. So ever since I was younger, it was in my head that like the goal was always to get good grades. But it didn't matter like how I got it. So I didn't have, if I could not go to class and get good grades, then in my head, I was like, okay, I still did my job of being a good Asian kid, and I got to do what I got to do. So I think I was always looking for like unconventional ways to achieve the goals that were set for me in the beginning of life. And then later on, obviously, I set my own goals. But earlier on, it was so ingrained in my head that I had to get good grades that I wish it wasn't like this. But I think I learned next to nothing in class because all I tried to figure out was like
Like
talk
how
to
to
the
hack the
teacher.
system,
No, it was like
right?
I was like, "How what's on the final? Like, what do I need to know?" And I would just keep trying to badger the teacher to telling me what was gonna be on the final, and it's like not as direct, but in different ways. And so I think that I got good at other things along the way, but, yeah, I think it's hard to look at people with ADHD who are Asian and be like, "Oh, because you got good grades, you don't have ADHD." Because, like, a lot of people who are Asian have good grades because it was just, like, what you had to get, and you would sacrifice other things for it.
Totally. And then one other thing from your upbringing or your childhood is, what about role models around entrepreneurship? Were your parents entrepreneurs, or how did you think that you were going to go down this path when you were a kid, skipping school and working at the mall full time?
Um, so I actually don't know where maybe a little bit from my dad. So, my dad, his background is actually in geology, but he ended up, over many, many decades. Now he works in finance for mines, essentially. Like he'll flip mines and connect people who are buying mines with each other. So, um, in some sense, yes.
Yeah.
And I think like our parents' generation, they just needed to find unconventional ways to do things because they had to literally like step from like here to here across the world with no support system. So I think you learn a lot from immigrant parents who are just making things happen.
Mhm.
Because even
Mhm.
when I just had this memory when I was in high school and I was working full time at the mall. I don't know, you're a guy, you might not know this, but do you know Uggs? Like the
Yeah,
shoes that
totally. Right.
so, I used to buy these fake Uggs from this, like, Chinese lady on Craigslist, and then I would, like, flip them at school, and everyone knew they were fake, but I was, like, the Ugg dealer. And then I used to also sell bubble tea at school at some point. I would drive to the mall and drive back to the school and sell bubble tea to everyone. So there was always, like I feel like it was a way that I was kind of, like, itching um this unfulfilled part of my brain that wasn't being filled by school.
Hmm, fascinating. Okay, well, that's a great background. I also love just exposing this different neurodiversity in a founder that we get to interview about raising capital, because I feel like some people may be worried about being ADD and getting to the point that you're at. So knowing that it can be done is great. We're going to fast forward a little bit and get you to the point where you are deciding to start this company. At the very beginning, did you feel like, I'm going to start a company that will need to have capital raised for it? Or did you just start? Like, because we love focusing on this idea of, like, for companies that raise capital, how do you do it? And your first decision to raise capital, was that something that was already baked into the company, or did you get to it later?
So, what we currently have, an ADHD coaching platform, is not what we first raised money for. Um,
Hmm.
when so we did YC in 2021, and that was with our old model of support groups for anxiety, depression, identity-based groups, interest-based groups. You had a bunch of different types of cohort-based groups that were happening, and it was in the middle of the pandemic. So it was tackling the loneliness pandemic. And we actually raised venture capital for that
For
concept.
that. Got it.
That is because that concept is very well fit in our minds at the time for VC funding, because we needed to get it to mass scale to get the right matches for people so that we could have groups for everything. That was the vision. And you could come in and find a group exactly for the things that you wanted to talk about. And so that was why we decided to go the VC route.
Mm.
However, we ended up pivoting over 2 years later. And we actually shut down that first one before even knowing what we were going to do next. And we already had investors on the cap table. So we actually didn't
Wow.
make a conscious decision for this business model to be VC funded.
Okay. So this is great. This is a lot of texture for me to react to and for people to kind of like learn. So I'm just looking at what was announced on Crunchbase. At least you raised like a tiny little bit through the YC round. Was the $1.3 million round in 2022? That was part of this company that you just described, right?
No. So that was a compilation of all the money we had raised to that date for the old concept.
For
And
the old company, right?
yes,
Okay,
this round, the 2.2 was the first round we raised off of this concept.
this new one, great. Okay, so now I love what you described. At some point, 2 years in, you had raised money for it, but you're like, this isn't working, and you're like, let's cut ties with this direction. Now let's go move over to something else. And at that point, you kind of hinted at it. You're not sure if this is going to be something that you continue to raise money for. Can you tell us a little bit about the mindset? Was it just like, let's try to find something that we can solve a problem around, and maybe it's just a break even business? Like, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so for this one, we had about maybe half of the money left in the bank from the first concept. And so I will say we already had a bias towards creating something that is VC fundable, that had venture scale returns that were possible because of the position that we were in. I don't, it's hard to say if I would have done it differently if we weren't. So we actually, once we started solving this problem and we realized that it was such a big problem that was unsolved, it became very clear to us quickly that it was more than venture scalable. So it ended up working out neatly, but we didn't come into the problem thinking about like, how do we make something venture scalable? I think that we came into the problem being like, this is clearly a massive unsolved problem. It's clearly in a growing space in terms of whether it's in terms of amount of people that are being impacted or in terms of like where we are culturally to be able to accept and use a concept like this,
Yeah,
and the general awareness around neurodiversity. So that was kind of how we thought about it. But we were already, I would say, pretty strongly biased to creating something that's venture scalable. And I think that over time, just being in the space, I think we just kind of fell in love with the concept, I guess, of like being able to like quickly impact that many people, especially if we have a mission driven product that is going to solve like real problems. And
yeah,
for me personally, I've always been really obsessed with this concept of like impact and profit going together and being able to prove that out like time after time. So even when I was in consulting, I was doing social impact consulting. So it meshed really well, all of this, with kind of our previous experience, our, I guess, like philosophies around what we want to do and the problem that was at hand. So I think it was a few things that never at the time is neat, but you can kind of post rationalize it as being a little bit like, oh, it's a perfect fit.
totally. Okay, so this is a great time in the journey of Shimmer to zoom in and get to a topic that I've been excited to bring up ever since I knew, one, your background, and two, that we were going to talk to you, which is this. So I have an opinion about founders that come out of YC, and especially that first little bit of capital that you get to raise. To me, that fundraise is in large part kind of handed to YC founders because YC is so amazing at generating the interest in their companies, doing demo day. And so they help set up kind of all the stuff that most other founders and in other rounds you have to do on your own. 2 years after YC, you're essentially pivoting, starting from scratch. You don't have the glow of demo day at YC. And so at some point you're in this journey, you're going to have to get ready to go fundraise. You have to get ready to go fundraise. And the thing about fundraising and preparing to fundraise is that there's a lot of like small, boring, annoying stuff, things that you have to do. It's kind of like kryptonite for people with ADD. It's like there's just like so much stuff that you really like in order to set up a great fundraiser. You really have to do these things. You have to work on a boring deck. You have to you have to do all these different things. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what was going on when the company when you were like, we're going to go raise this next round of capital. Um, Tell me a little bit about like what's going on in the company and then what you had to start doing to prepare to fundraise.
Yeah, so I think that everything in being a founder, the first time I would say the first time you do it is, like, infinitely harder than every other time that you do something, and so I say that because I do agree that it's harder to raise after YC, but if you can get the hardest one with the most amount of help, then the second time you do it, there are certain aspects of it that are a little bit more muscle memory than someone who
Mm,
hasn't ever approached it. So I will say that our round was probably a lot easier for us to raise because we had went through YC, but more so because of the experience that we gained and kind of like
mm.
the systems that we had set up in place um, to kind of mini counteract your
No.
opinion. In terms of where Shimmer was at, so at the time we had several friends who went out for their Series A about 2 years after YC, the same time period that we were, and they did not have a good time. It was a bad market, previous Series A metrics, which at the time when we went through YC, they're like, "Oh, if you get to 1,000,000 in ARR, you can think about, doing a Series A." That just wasn't cutting it anymore with the market being so tough, and a lot of them had just turned around and instead just raised a seed.
Crystal brought up some solid points about YC and certain accelerators I might have missed before. On one hand, raising after YC can be difficult because of how smooth YC made fundraising feel for founders coming out the gate. But on the other hand, YC gives you such a solid foundation to build off of, much more than founders who have never raised before. When we come back, we'll hear from Crystal about how her seed round came together. Like many of you, my last venture-backed startup was a SaaS business. In that company early on, we had the opportunity to sell into a large enterprise, but ran into some walls when they asked us if we were SOC 2 certified. Not only were we not certified, we also found out that it would take our small team a ton of time to get that done, and so we ended up abandoning the deal. If you haven't run into a situation like that where a potential customer or investor is asking if you're SOC 2, HIPAA, GDPR, or ISO 27001 certified, you probably will soon. But unlike me, you could use a company called Vanta to help. Vanta helps automate up to 90% of the compliance work, getting you audit ready in weeks rather than months, and eliminating up to 85% of the costs. Not only that, but Vanta can start small with you and scale up as you grow, helping you land bigger deals and earn customer trust. The best part is, Vanta is offering funded listeners $1,000 off for going to vanta.com/funded. That's VANTA.com/funded for $1,000 off your service. Check it out.
And so we knew what the market looked like. And that's another thing that I would say, not just YC, but being a part of any accelerator is helpful for is like you'll have a lot of people that are in the same stage as you to be able to calibrate years down the road when they're probably taking the same next step as you, if they're still around. So what we did is actually we called our old seed pre-seed, which this is now common knowledge that almost everyone does, and then we called this new round a seed instead of going out to do a Series A. And so we had around 1,000,000 in revenue. We had a really great story too because we had got from 0 to 1,000,000 in less than a year of just launching our product to the public. And so when we went out, we knew that from a traction perspective, we were going to be far higher than any other seed stage startup that's raising. And so I wanted to make sure that when I went out, that I am in a relative like strength of position. So I could like, do you want to call it a Series A and make it harder for yourself? And maybe it'll be better. It'll in some ways be better. It's like debatable because you raise your Series A or you want to do a seed. and it'll be a lot easier for you. You can close it faster and you can get back to building. And then you can
Yeah.
probably raise your Series A further down the road. So that was kind of our thought process at the time and where we were in terms of like our company. And then in terms of like how we set things up, we set it up pretty similarly to when we did it after YC. And I think that was probably we underestimated now, like, to support your point, we underestimated that it would be a lot harder. Because when you're coming out of YC, literally every hundreds of other companies around you are raising at the exact same time. So when you hit someone up for an intro, they're gonna send you a bunch of intros because they know that they were gonna ask you for the same thing. It was a lot harder coming this time because there were only like 3 to 4 people that were around me in the same industry who were raising from investors. So we kind of bunched together and helped each other,
Mm,
but that's very different from having like 300 people for who are helping you. And it'll also be very different if someone had not went through an accelerator and didn't have or like a community and didn't have even the 3 to 4 people that I had this time. Because it's not
sure.
just about like anyone who's raising. They have to be like at a similar stage, like looking for similar investors for you to really like trade those introductions.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, do you remember what your target list looked like? Do you remember like numbers wise, how many investors did you think you would want to talk to for this round?
Yeah. So I actually remember I had talked to one of our pre-seed investors and was like, oh, I'm gonna just close this round in 3 weeks. And he kind of just like laughed and he was like, good luck. So I was definitely overconfident going into the process. But we didn't have like a set number. My goal was to just always keep my calendar full until we're done.
Mm,
So I had 5-ish meetings each day, probably more than 5 in the beginning phases when I was just pumping through first
yeah.
combos. And then later, like a month or 2 down the road, it like dwindled down to just the folks that we were doing like later stage diligence with.
Yeah.
So I actually just counted today, or like I did like a rough count. There's probably around 150 conversations that I did in, it was probably around 2 months.
That's great. Always love highlighting and underlining the amount of work that goes into these things because you did graduate, you did go through YC, you do have all the logos, you worked at Bain, all these things. And I think people are like, oh, people with less of a background and less of a network than you will go out to try to raise and do far less work and be annoyed that they weren't successful. And so for you to be like 150 conversations, it's a good thing to hear. So kudos to that. 2.5 months of conversations along the path of that process. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs. Were there any stories that stand out to you in terms of like gut punches or painful experiences that you're willing to share?
Yeah, so I think I learned the first time around to, like, never get too excited about any one investor, because you'll probably get it pulled away from you.
Mm,
Obviously, it's, like, a lesson that you learn and then you just forget about, especially with ADHD. So there were a few investors that I got really attached to, and I kept telling myself not to get attached to, and it's always, like, if it's the 2nd, 3rd conversation, they're doing diligence, it's natural that your hopes start to go up and you start to get kind of invested in them. Also, because my process is a bit extra. Like, if I really like this investor, I will listen to like all of their podcast episodes. I will like get in their head. So it's 150 conversations, but it's also a lot more legwork, especially for the ones that you're excited about.
right.
So I mean, there were quite a few. Like, there were a handful probably this time. There were way more the first time, but there were a handful where I don't know, you just like think that you're almost over the line. They've like done all their like diligence. And this time also the diligence was far more than the first time because we had more data and because the markets were, so they can kind of drag their feet more. But there actually was, so our first lead investor, so we have 2 co-leads, Brianne Kimmel from Work Life Ventures. The day she came in was actually like, it's crazy how life works sometimes. There was like one day where I was like, "Oh, I should just give up. We don't actually need the money. We could just raise like 6 months later." Because I was just so sick of the conversations. I had so many combos with people who were just like unaligned with what we're doing, and I had to end a lot of calls early, and I was just so sick of it. And then just on that weekend where I was like, telling my co-founder, I was like, "Okay, we're like ending this after this week." And then on that Friday, that's when she was like, "Yeah, I'm in." And like I'll co-lead around. And I was like, oh, okay, like relief, but also, okay, now I had already like mentally like closed this book and then I had to like reopen it. So I think sometimes you just have to push through like one more. Like it and that feeling is very disorienting because it could be just behind the next one, which is kind of crazy to think about because it really just takes one yes. Like a lot of founders who have amazing businesses that you ask about their story, it's always like this one flipped it for them, right? And they had
Yeah.
so many no's beforehand. So like what you said, it's like it kind of is a numbers game, especially at the early stage, and especially if you don't have the right, I guess, like muscle to figure out like which, like through looking their website, through looking at their podcasts, like which ones might be a good fit so that you can have even like a higher quality funnel. It gets even harder because sometimes you're just tired and you just don't have time to make sure the funnel is quality. You're just like, just get me in people because I just need to
Yeah.
practice also. So there's that as well.
No, it's glad we were able to pull back the curtain there too, because at the as we start setting up this part of the story of like preparing to fundraise, what are you going to do? And you did one of the things that is a really great tactic, which is like start to raise the round that you just passed by, as in like the would be like a reach, but for the seed, you were at $1 million of revenue, like you feel squarely beyond that, and so like a very healthy seed. You were part of YC, like all these positive things, and we know the outcome is that you raised around. But as we dig deeper, it's 150 plus conversations. You hit that same wall that almost everyone does. Like I will talk to people that raise $1 million and people that raise $50 million, and most of the time there's like this feeling like this might not happen.
Yeah.
Like this, and you were telling me that you were saying it's like a very disorienting feeling, and like should I keep pushing? But for you to get past that and get to a great lead like Brianne at Work Life is amazing. I do want to like make sure we double click and have you hold on to the more positive side of that story, which is when you did hear from Brianne, it sounded like, at a pretty wide swing, a roller coaster of like, man, we're not going to raise and I'm going to cancel this. Tell me a little bit more about like how do you remember where you were? How did she reach out? Or was it like a complete surprise?
Um, I don't feel like any of it was a surprise because we were getting to like late stage diligence with most of the funds that we liked. So I
Yeah.
think that was like the one signal that we should keep going. Cause I would say that like if you're not getting past the first conversation for like a lot of your calls, then probably there's something that you need to fix, whether it's the business itself or it's your pitch or your storytelling. So it wasn't really a surprise that she said yes. It was a surprise how early in the process it was because she didn't do a lot of, I would say, like, numerical diligence, which post YC, nobody really did any, like, quantitative diligence, probably because we didn't have data and because of the market and because we were post
Yeah.
YC. But this time, most companies were doing, like, pretty extensive diligence, and I think it really just came down to fit, because Bree has ADHD, and she's tried a lot of ADHD products, and she just intuitively understood what we were doing the first time we chatted. So it is also a lot just about fit and getting to that right person who actually just gets what you're doing so you can skip all the beginning part of like convincing them that this is a big problem, convincing them how it works, like showing them member testimonials. Like obviously we always do anyways, but there's some people who are like, okay, just skip through that. I get it. I know why it
Yeah.
works. Like I believe in this. Like now tell me why like you're the right person to do this. So I think I don't know exactly where I mean, I was probably at home, right? Like, I was just pitching the whole day. I was probably just at home, not doing anything special. But actually that was the year, we got into Forbes 30 under 30, and actually that weekend was the whatever they call it, the conference at the retreat in Cleveland, and I didn't book a ticket there because I remember being like, "Oh, like, if I can't raise this round, like, I don't deserve to go to this thing." So, my co-founder actually had a ticket in a hotel, and he was gonna go by himself. And then the moment that Bree signed that, I actually remember the first thing I did was I bought a ticket to
Uh,
London for the next day, so that I could be with my co-founder, since we work remote from, like, New York and at the time LA. But, so it was so serendipitous that it happened, like, just that day.
so good. I love ending, our conversations around that story because it's important and valuable for everyone to hear the downs, but definitely want to make sure you have a chance to remember and celebrate some of the good times. One of the things that I do like asking, like kind of separately, we might not use it, are just fun questions about the business. So you support a lot of, I'm sure, very different people with ADHD. What are some of the crazier or more interesting like backgrounds and characteristics of some of your customers? Anything fun to be able to share about um, who and how Shimmer supports its community?
Yeah, so when I first started Shimmer, I thought that most people would be like me, like, like you come, you want like productivity, you want to do better at work or like kind of like more basic stuff. And I was actually just floored by the diversity of the people who come. My favorite actually are people who are retired. Oddly, we get a
Huh.
lot of people who are retired, men and women, and they either were diagnosed later in life or they've always had ADHD or they always knew they had ADHD but never kind of really did anything about it. And then they put their identity on work or whatever it was. And now that identity has been removed and they're almost like redefining their life with this new information about themselves or like reframing of looking at it. And I find it's always, I don't know, it's more human and personal because it is really just all about them and what they want in life and how they want to spend the next 20 years of their life, how they want to reconnect with things that they didn't feel like they were able to explore throughout their life. And for me, those are always, and always the success stories as well for them are always more, um, I guess, like heartwarming and human than some of the interesting and amazing in its own way, but, like, the more kind of, like, work-related stuff that you would imagine that people with ADHD would wanna be working on.
Huh. That's super touching. That's awesome. Um, Hey, one last thing that I wanted to ask is it's been very fun to connect with founders through this podcast because I find that founders have amazing connections to other founders, and because we've been doing this now for 3 years, we've already started seeing this come around where we interviewed Christine Cassiopo from Vanta, and we said, who are some of the up and coming founders that you want to shout out or that you love? Anyone in your network, that's just getting started? And she was like, I love this guy who's coming out of Intercom to start a new company. His name is Bobby Pinero. And anyways, we just had him on the podcast because he raised his Series A. Are there any other founders that are in your network that are just getting started that you want to throw their names out so that we can keep an eye on them in case in a couple of years they get a chance to talk to us?
There's someone I think you definitely should interview. She's not necessarily just getting started, but her name's Bailey and her company's called Perimeter. And it's like a mapping software for emergency kind of natural disaster situations all over the world. And she has such an incredible story around fundraising. I would definitely interview her. I think I'll be paraphrasing, but the first round, I think she talked to like hundreds of investors. And then she had one mindset shift, which I'll let you talk to her about. And
Oh, yeah.
apparently, since then, she's never gotten a no from an investor, which is crazy. Yeah.
That was my episode with Christal Wang, co-founder and CEO of Shimmer, the ADHD coaching platform for adults. As someone who fully understands the pain point this product solves, it's really cool to see companies like Shimmer get funded. I hope this episode reminds you to push through investor rejection. Your next meeting just might be your first yes. When we come back, we'll see what thoughts my producer Paige has to share. If you're a crazy busy entrepreneur like me, I know one thing's certain: you have too much to do. Of course, you'd love to hire someone else to help, but I bet you think you can't afford it. It turns out you can, especially if you use a recruiting firm called Agent, like I have in recruiting my last 4 team members. Agent specializes in recruiting overseas talent. Now, I know what you're thinking, not another virtual assistant hiring agency. Yes, they can help you hire assistants, but they can also help you hire skilled talent like marketers, designers, and even engineers at a fraction of the cost. Now, if you're looking to add more leverage to your team, check out fundedpod.com/agent. That's AGENT to add your next team member. You can thank me later. Hey, Paige.
Hi, Jason.
Do you like this episode?
I did. I actually did like this episode a lot. And I felt like, because sometimes I listen to the episodes and I'm like, shit, I don't really know if I have many comments or things I want to discuss. But with this episode, there was quite a few things that jumped out to me that I wanted to get your opinion on and share. So, yeah. Um, First thing is that I thought it was interesting. So, just a quick recap is she raised for her first company, which was focused on support groups. And she raised a small round for that at YC. And then she raised, I think, total like 1.3 million for that first company, that first idea. And then she pivoted 2 years later to an ADHD coaching platform, Shimmer. She raised her most recent round for. And my question with this was, whenever I hear pivoted, I honestly I have so many questions that come to my head. And I was wondering, I'm like, she had an existing cap table. Can you just pivot to anything and like keep that cap table? Or because I know there's multiple options, right? You probably could shut it down and then start Shimmer, or you could pivot and keep that same. Yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
looking for some extra layering there.
Yeah. So I think it's a great question, by the way, and I can generalize it for a bunch of different things when it comes to what a founder can and can't do. I think there are a lot of things that fall under this category of like people think that they maybe can't do something. And most of the ability to do something while running a company um, falls into this category of like social expectations. There actually aren't any repercussions or you know, there are like for the most part aren't any like control provisions that make a founder stay on a certain business model, attack a certain vertical. It's more that it can feel uncomfortable and bad to tell all of your investors that you put money to back me to do an idea that I told you about, and a year later I'm changing it. And
Yeah.
that can feel socially difficult to do because of what you gave as your almost your promise of what you would do. As it pertains to like what you're allowed to do, as you're kind of allowed to do most things, but as long as you control the board, as in they don't have the power to fire you, then really investors can't do much in terms of deciding what strategies you employ.
So you could start like a CPG company and then you could switch to like a SaaS or something and keep that same.
Totally,
That's
totally.
crazy.
I mean, you could do a lot of different things, to be honest. Like, and I wonder if our legal mentor in the additive fundraising community would tell me I'm wrong here, but like, there's also like I don't know if I should even put this out in the world, but you can go raise money, and you're like your goal is to go raise money, and you're telling people you're going to drive towards a huge outcome and like try to get to an IPO, and you can raise $1 million and just be like, no, I think I'm just going to run a lifestyle business and like generate little bits of revenue and pay myself a great salary. And I don't think there's a lot of recourse from investors. The only thing is that like that founder probably would never be able to raise
Yeah.
money. Their reputation would be destroyed in
Yep.
terms of investor trust. But like, yeah, that's possible.
That's crazy to me. Yeah. Like, and then I was also on top of that wondering, so when they decided to pivot, they still had about like half of the money they said left. I was wondering, could you like shut down that company and then start a new one and then take that money with you? And then would your cap table go with you because the money's attached to them? I don't.
So when it, I don't know if you're exactly asking about shutting down a company or doing something different, but it does open up a really good point, which is I do think founders sometimes hold on too long. Like um, there's a lot of praise that gets handed out to founders that are extremely gritty and stick with it and never die and then keep figuring it out. But at the same time, I think that messaging can be detrimental to situations where founders shouldn't keep going, right? Like there's a bad team dynamic. There's like no product market fit and no energy to keep going. And it's more, it's more harm than good, especially to the founder themselves. And so in some ways, it can make sense to shut down with still money in the company. And in those cases, if you formally shut down the company, you would usually distribute the remaining capital to your investors in terms of preference. So
Oh yeah.
the investors and the debt holders that had the highest preference, you would liquidate the company and ratably distribute the remaining capital. There's also another thing that I think makes a lot of sense too, which is like sometimes you raise money to go after an idea and you give it your best shot. Like you really give it your best shot and you play out the hypothesis that you raised capital for. And this might be controversial, but like if you actually put it all the way out there and pushed it really hard and figured out that that wasn't it, I think in some cases, it makes sense to shut down that company and start another company. Like if you had another idea and you really didn't feel like the investors from the first company like contributed, would be contributing to this next company, instead of like pivoting and then maintaining the same dilution that you took from the first investors and then raising more money and getting diluted again and then drawing this out. Sometimes I think it makes sense to shut that company down, rest, give it some space, and then start another company. Other people would say, no, you gotta keep going, keep pivoting, keep like taking the investors along for the ride forever. I think there's a balance.
Yeah.
Always a bit of a departure here. But with her, she pivoted, kept the same investors, used that capital to then work on the next idea, all under the same corporate umbrella. And so she has the exact same cap table and continue to add on to the existing cap table.
I just find it so interesting. That's why I wanted to talk about it. Like, because you hear so much about pivoting and things, and it just, in my head, I'm like, how does that work? In her case, though, I mean, it wasn't this gigantic leap. It was more so like, I feel like they found a really more niche aspect of what they were doing and they honed in on it and they killed it. And then something else. So obviously they ended up pivoting to Shimmer, an ADHD coaching platform. And what they ended up doing is they raised a $2.2 million seed round. But what they did was they changed. So that previous round that they had raised for their other company, they had called it a seed round, I think. Like they had already raised a seed round. And so what she said she did was change the name from that one from seed to pre-seed. And then they went out and raised a $2.2 million seed round. And she said this is like a pretty common practice. And It had me thinking, and it makes perfect sense, obviously, as the market changes, you kind of have to do that because you would probably have a really hard time raising a Series A. But then it makes me feel like, does the name not mean that much then? You know what I mean? It's more so just about what they're trying to, or what they expect out of each, I don't know.
You're hitting the nail on the head, Paige. And I think, again, I love it when I see you evolving and you're understanding the nuances of fundraising are really shining through right now. I think the biggest thing to realize here is she's showing you how much perception and expectations influences fundraising, right? It's just as simple as being like, well, we raised the seed round. That positioning, meaning that, look, a seed round is getting into the first shreds of product market fit. So you get there and then Series A is about scaling that product market fit. If you're coming in and you don't to raise a Series A, if your last round was a seed, the expectation is that you got product market fit and you're scaling it, which means if you have product market fit, you have significant revenue and it's growing. And if that's not the case for you, even though you called yourself your first round a seed round, you're not dead in the water. You're just facing an uphill battle and you're kind of forced to really tell the story and try to get people to wrap their heads around it. So a very common thing to do is just like sort of rename the round, rename the first round that you you raise that, and then go raise at the thing that people would expect you to be raising at the level of traction that you're at today.
Yeah, and it's funny too because probably, I don't know, 9 months back or 12 months back, she might have been able to get away with cuz she had around 1 million ARR. And that was in 1 year she was able to get to that, which is like, whoa, that's huge. And in another time that would have been like, "Oh, Series A." And then
Yeah.
things change, right? And then it's like, "Oh, that's definitely not a Series A." And I just think it's crazy. But you always say too like I hope I don't butcher this, but raise the round that basically you're most comfortable with, the one that you think you can nail. So she said, she's like, we could have tried to do the Series A, but it wouldn't have been like, oh my God, look at all that they have. But with the seed, they're like, holy crap, this is insane traction.
Exactly. You have tons of traction for this.
Yeah.
And I definitely stand by that. The haters will say, well, like, shouldn't you be going after what you think you can get to? Well, like, what if they were, what if they were more aggressive and they could have raised a Series A? I really do think too, if she were raising that seed round and it drew enough interest and people were like, man, this is crazy, it would probably attract some people who would want to do a Series A in a bigger round, and it would pull her into the ability to then push harder and increase the round size and make it more of a round that looked like a Series A. Again, we don't really care what we call it. It's more about like how much money you're raising against what valuation at that point.
Yeah. And my mindset's changed around like what a round actually is for. And it's like, yeah, you could try to go for the big round and maybe you should. Who knows? I don't know. But all you're really trying to do is get from A to B and make a big jump to get somewhere that will then, give you traction
and it's also like, does she know how she would use the capital?
Yeah.
Like, raising two and change, she probably knew exactly how she would deploy that capital. And sometimes when you're like, well, this firm wants to actually invest 5 billion, not 2, then you're like, okay, well, how would I use that money? Like, we're a little bit early to like deploy all that capital, and it can be bad. Like, it can force people to spend money faster than they were initially planning on. A lot of times spending money in channels that aren't ready to be spent on. So you kind of waste the money anyways. And so you didn't get as far as you actually should have gotten with all that dilution that you're taking on. So
yeah, Ian Swanson touched on this too. I remember he was saying like in one, I think his second venture-backed company out of the 3, very impressive guy. He was saying like they took on a bunch of capital and they ended up just not using it in the best ways. And I just had never, it makes sense when you hear it, but I feel like it shouldn't be natural or automatic to correlate more money with always being better. It should be like the amount of money you need, to get from A to B.
By the way, and that is one of those pieces of advice that gets repeated over and over again by like investors, experts in the space, is like, don't raise more money than you need. If you raise more money, you'll spend more money like wastefully. And I think for most people, they think about that and they're like, really? I mean, like, I think I can manage my own spend. I think I can. And it's not until you get into the situation where you're overcapitalized and you do burn through more money than you need to, where you're like, yeah, it's very tempting to spend the money that you have. Like, it's like burning a hole in your pocket. I've seen very few cases of founders that overcapitalized at a certain round and were able to manage their own spend.
Yeah, but everyone wants to F around and find out. So
Yeah.
who knows? I might do the same thing if I was in their situation. Talk about another very impressive thing. She had 150 conversations. I know you love this too, with VCs in 2 months. And like on top of that was doing crazy research on each one, trying to learn more about them and stuff. But again, she had a pretty impressive background. She worked at Bain. She had been through YC. She had already raised money before. And it wasn't even a thought in her mind, like, let me just see what I can do with the stronger connections that I have. No, she went full force. And even then, it still was a little bit difficult. And it wasn't until, how it always goes, she was about to maybe pull back and try again in a few months. The co-leads came together and made the round happen. So
totally. Yeah. On that last point, you're either dying of thirst or you're drowning. It happens all the time.
mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. I feel like we need to tell this message over and over again using different examples with all sorts of backgrounds. But it's like, if someone like Christal with that type of network, that type of pedigree, that type of traction, etc., is going balls to the wall and, mapping out 150 150 meetings that she's going to have to take. Like, if you even have that level of assets that you can bring to the table, and you're not doing as much as she's doing, got to check yourself. If you feel like you have less than she has, and you're not doing as much as she did, definitely have to check yourself. So,
because that's not even the full. Now I'm thinking about it. If she had 150 conversations, and there's got to be some that they just didn't think it was the right fit. So I just wonder what that target list looked like. That's crazy. That's some serious effort.
Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to touch on is just I wanted to share some advice that she gave that I really liked. And I'm just going to paraphrase it. But she was saying towards the end of the conversation that if you're not getting past the first convo on majority of your calls, it's really there is something that you might need to reevaluate there, whether it's your pitch or your business or something else. And I just loved how she kind of ended on that note, because it's a hard truth, right? But I just liked that and I wanted to share it.
Yeah, but it can be very hard to give 100% generalized advice.
Yeah.
In life, right? In fundraising and even more. And there's this advice that makes sense, which is look, you have to believe in your pitch, and you have to believe it more than other people. And you can't be swayed by haters who don't understand the idea. And that is for sure correct. But at the same time, you have to have an awareness, a little bit of self-awareness. And you have to open your ears and be willing to listen to people's feedback, and cerebral enough, analytical enough to kind of take some things and be like, okay, the first time I hear it, look, they don't understand. I'm going to keep pushing forward. If after the 5th, 10th, 15th, and none of them are progressing and people have similar bits of feedback, I agree with Christal. You got to go back to the lab. You got to kind of look in the mirror and make sure you understand why this is happening. So it's a tough balance where you have to understand, where you draw the line.
Yeah. I think that might be the debrief.
I love it.
If you're looking for more insights, strategies, and support around fundraising, subscribe to our newsletter. It's at fundedpod.com/newsletter. And find me on social. I'm at Jayeh, that's JAYYEH, on almost every platform. I respond to DMs and newsletter replies, so hit me up. This episode was produced by Paige Randall.
Hey guys.
Thanks also to John O'Lee from Adamant.
Hey everyone.
And as always, one last thanks to our sponsor, Vanta, the leading automated security and compliance platform.